Oh, let's go. Yes. G'day, it's Michael Guest here and welcome to fishing. It's time to have a bit of a chat about getting your soft plastic and your jig head combination right. You walk into your local tackle store and there's this huge range of soft baits on the wall, and next to that there's all these packets of jig heads, and it's about how to marry those up and get the most out of it with your lure fishing. Now, for a start, there's 4 or 5 really basic sort of shapes when it comes to soft baits. So we've got big, long, slender ones like this one, which is what we call a jerk shad. So we've got those ones. We've got lures that have got a paddle tail, so that'll vibrate and swim along. So paddle tail style lures. Other ones which are awesome, which have got a curly tail, so that'll make a lot of action just by winding it along. That one, you don't have to do too much with that one. And then we've got what we call creature baits, so ones that look like little yabbies and prawns. They've got legs and things hanging off them everywhere, and they come right down into tiny little sizes like this little one here. So there's a whole range to suit different types of fishing. So for a start, if I'm going trout fishing, I'm not throwing a great big 7-inch jerk shad like this one here, and then it's about marrying up your jig heads to suit each soft plastic. Then when you look at the jig head wall, I've got all sorts of big saltwater type jig heads. This one's a 1.5 ounce 7.0, so a great big jig head. This one's a 1/6 of an ounce 5.0, so more of a snapper soft plastic style jig head. Get into our estuary stuff, we've got a 1/4 ounce 2.0 there. So then right down to this 1/50 of an ounce hidden weight jig head here. So it's about trying to marry everything up, and a lot of it comes down to common sense. So for example, this great big 1.5 ounce saltwater pro jig head. So that's something that we'd use in quite deep water. Obviously, it's got a big heavy jig head. It's going to sink like a rock. You'd never throw this in an estuary system. It's got an incredibly strong hook involved in it. So something you'd use off the reef in fast running water, in deeper water where you really need to get that jig head down through the current and down into the depths. That's something you'd use that for, and you'd marry it up with a big soft plastic. So this is a 7-inch, but even a 9-inch, a bigger one, or a big grub tail is going to marry up really, really well with that one. So that's that there. And then while I've got this lure, if I was snapper fishing offshore, trying to catch a snapper, and I wanted a soft bait to swim down through the water column, perfect setup here. You can see that by the time once I rig that, that hook exposure is going to come out through that jerk shad there. The end of that jerk shad will sit nicely up against that jig head, and that's really a perfect match up there. And then we can up the size or the weight of that jig head to suit the conditions we're fishing. So if it's really windy and you're drifting really fast, you might end up with a 1/2 ounce or even a 5/8 of an ounce jig head. But if you're in shallow water and it's a bit calmer and you want that really good wafting action that snapper love, then you'd stick with these really lightweight jig heads and let that jerk shad swim down. So that's there. And once we get into the estuary system and we're trying to marry up chasing things like flathead, I guess, is probably one of the most popular ones in Australia. Lures like this one here, it's got the curly tail on the end, and we want to get a jig head that works. So this one's a 1/4 ounce 2.0, and once we rig that up, that hook exposure is going to be really good. It's the right size jig head to suit that lure. That 1/4 ounce jig head, perfect for anything from sort of that 3 to 4 metres up to about 10 metres. Even if there's not too much current, you'll get a 1/4 ounce jig head down. And don't forget, anytime you're using soft plastic lures, the lighter you can fish, the more bites you'll get. And we go right down to our little minis, and don't forget there is so many jig heads in between, so think about it. That 1/50 of an ounce, you need to be throwing that on really, really light tackle, hopefully with a bit of breeze in your back, and that might be something that you put our little crab shaped pattern here, our little creature bait. He might sit on that jig head there, and you can see that jig head there lines up perfectly with the length of that little soft bait, and it all marries in. If you muck it up and you try and jam this soft plastic on too big a jig head, the grub keeper's probably too big for it, it'll split the end of it, and it's just not the right setup. You've got this massive big heavy head that's going to sink too fast, and even here the hook's going to come out way down here. You're going to reduce the action of that lure. So think about how deep you're fishing. Try and fish as light as you can always. That's the secret to getting more bites, because as I said before, if you've got too heavy a jig head, it is just going to slam to the bottom and it looks unnatural. The same deal if you're offshore and you're chasing bigger fish, then you need to find a jig head that's got a hook in it that can handle the drag pressure that you're going to use too. So something with a finer wire style hook like this is not really ideal offshore. Certainly great at lighter drag settings and lighter tackle when you're inshore, river systems and that type of stuff. But if you're chasing things like snapper and kingfish and big hard pulling species offshore, then you need to go to jig heads like that.